clapping.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Welcome to today's panel. I'm Andre Merrick, Provost, Executive Vice President at Roosevelt University, and I get the privilege of introducing today's panel. I want to thank Herb H. Franks, whose generosity helped fund this seminar. Mr. Franks was once an Assistant Attorney General for Illinois, and his passion for understanding state and local politics has enabled us to bring together this distinguished group of panelists. The title for today's panel is A New Deal for the City. And how appropriate to have this very panel at the university named for Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. In fact, the original New Deal started a long effort to remake America into a more just and equitable nation. And that effort continues today. In particular, cities face incredible challenges in the coming decades, from aging infrastructure to a desperate need for more affordable housing to better funding for our schools and school systems, to name only a few of the issues. It's always tempting to be pessimistic about problems we face and to wonder if they can ever be fixed. So I'm particularly excited about today's panelists who have wrestled with these problems and are focused on revitalizing cities and making them into the kind of shining city on a hill that Americans have always dreamed about, and for which you'll get coverage in your first semester of U.S. history classes, guaranteed, right? The city on a hill. We're fortunate to have Brad Hunt as our moderator today. He's now the chair of the history department at Loyola University. And while I hold Loyola in the highest esteem, I would argue that he once held an even more important position. For a number of years, he was a professor at Roosevelt University, as well as dean and a vice provost. And it's with great pleasure to be able to welcome him back. He's a renowned urban historian in his own right and has written several books and articles about Chicago, examining the issues we will be discussing today. And he has distinguished himself as someone who can bridge the gap between the scholarly world and the general public. In 2019, he won the National Council on Public History's Outstanding Public History Award for leading the Newberry Library's Chicago 1919 project, which partnered with a number of Chicago's cultural institutions to confront the history of Chicago's 1919 race riots and their legacies today. So please join me in welcoming Professor Hunt and our panelists.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and it's a delight to be back at Roosevelt and in this wonderful space. I'm looking forward to our conversation this afternoon. Let me first start by introducing our panelists. I'll start to my left. Lisa Yun Lee is the Executive Director of the National Public Housing Museum here in Chicago. It recently broke ground this past Tuesday, a week ago, and it's in the process of being built as we speak. It is the only cultural institution devoted to telling the story of public housing in this country, with a mission to, quote, preserve, promote, and propel the right of all people to a place where they can live and prosper, a place to call home. She has previously served as the director of the University of Illinois at Chicago's School of Art and Art History, and is the director of the Jane Addams Hull House Museum, which she reinvigorated into an important cultural force in Chicago. She has a PhD from Duke University and wrote a book on the philosopher Theodore Adorno. She is a prolific writer, publishing on arts, culture, diversity, and politics. Welcome to my friend Lisa.
Thank you.
To her left is Alderman Carlos Ramirez-Rosa. Alderman Ramirez-Rosa is Alderman of the 35th Ward on Chicago's northwest side, which includes portions of Logan Square, Irving Park, Hermosa, Avondale, and Albany Park, kind of along the north branch of the Chicago River. He was first elected to the City Council in 2015 at the age of 26, defeating a 12-year incumbent. He won re-election again in 2019. He is the inaugural chair and dean of the Democratic Socialist Caucus in the Chicago City Council, and he served as the vice chair of the City Council's Latino Caucus, and he's also a member of the Progressive Caucus and the LGBTQ Caucus. His policy interests, among others, include affordable housing, immigration reform, and police reform. Alderman Ramirez-Rosa was born and raised in Chicago with parents who hail from Puerto Rico and Mexico. He graduated from Whitney Young High School and the University of Illinois. He has been profiled nationally for his progressive accomplishments in publications including The Nation, Mother Jones, The Jacobin, and Chicago Magazine. He, too, is a prolific writer and has published 14 op-ed pieces in the last 4 years in major publications in Chicago and across the country. Welcome, Alderman Ramirez-Rosa. And finally, but not least, Dr. Larry Bennett is Professor Emeritus of Political Science at DePaul University and was until recently the Executive Director of North Branch Works, a nonprofit neighborhood organization that promotes balanced, job-creating economic development along the North Branch of the Chicago River. During a lengthy and distinguished career at DePaul University, Larry authored or edited 8 influential books on the political economy of Chicago, including titles such as Where Are Poor People to Live? Transforming Public Housing Communities, and The New Chicago, A Social and Cultural Analysis, and finally, The Third City, Chicago and American Urbanism with the University of Chicago Press in 2010. Another prolific author. Welcome to my colleague, Larry. Thank you all. This is the American Dream Reconsidered conference, and so I'd like to start us out by thinking about what the old American dream was and what a new American dream could look like for Chicago. How has it been defined in the past? How has it been defined for different people and groups? But what would a new vision, a new version of the American dream look like here in Chicago? And I open that to the panel.
Who wants to start?
Who starts?
I'm okay.
Lisa, go.
I'm okay to start.
Yes.
First, I
Okay,
just want to
Lisa.
say it's such a joy to be here at Roosevelt University, a place that just proudly embraces a social justice mission. You all are so lucky, and especially in these times, so thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here. I mean, I'm a philosopher by training, and so I kind of want to interrogate your question, right?
Please.
To start. Well, one, I know that it's not a single thing, and I think that's really important. There's a beautiful quote by the writer Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie where she says that we should never reduce a complex person, a complex thing, or complex situation to a single story. And that when you actually reject the single story and you reject the idea that there is just one narrative about any one person or place or thing, you can regain a kind of paradise. And I know that in my own work in public housing, that's exactly what I do. That when you reject a single story about public housing, for example, you are all of a sudden able to tell stories about complex networks of friendships and people who work together to fight police violence. You are able to talk about bridge clubs, poetry clubs that Gwendolyn Brooks founded at Cabrini Green. You're able to talk about veterans who came back from the war and lived in public housing. And you can actually challenge this sort of mainstream notion that public housing is a failed policy, because we know that we need to distinguish between the stories of resistance and resilience of individuals and the sort of litany of systemic racism and policies that actually led to sort of the oppression of certain groups of people, and also telling the stories of the injustice of capitalism, for example, like all of these things, right? So when you ask your question about what is the new American dream, one, like I think we have to open that up and just sort of say that it's never been a single thing, and that it needs to actually have multiple meanings for multiple people. But one last thing that I want to say about this before I also open it up with other people is that in my own work in housing, I see that there is a manufactured American dream at a certain point in America at the turn of the century where somehow the American dream included home ownership, right? And this was manufactured, I say, because it's not as if when the first Western sort of peoples landed here and started to colonize the United States and sort of unleash genocidal, sort of moments here on Indigenous Americans, that they were like, ooh, if we just had a mortgage and a home ownership, that's the reason, like this is what America is, right? But in the early 20th century, for example, the real estate lobby was extremely strong, and they started to promulgate this notion that home ownership is what bred real men. I mean, it was a very heteronormative notion, it was a patriarchal notion, and it was this one idea, and that had to actually be manufactured. And so once we started untangling that and understanding the history of how home ownership became linked to the idea of progress, then I think it opens up a whole host of possibilities of other ways of being in the world around equity and things like that. So I think that's really important.
Shall I? Okay, I'll go second. I'll respond to that by thinking about cities and their relationship to whatever might have constituted the American dream. And I think one of the really interesting ironies of American culture is that there was this American dream as articulated in part through the techniques that Lisa has just alluded to in the 20th century of a suburban home with a yard around it, automobile dependent, definitely a sexual division of labor in terms of who did what in the household or outside the household. And even as that was something like the characteristic understanding of the American dream, cities functioned as these places that had accepted millions upon millions of immigrants who settled in cities, who created neighborhoods, who thrived. And yet cities were often not really considered to be part of the American dream. It was something that you were supposed to escape from. And that is part of the multiplicity of stories that Lisa is referring to. I would say very directly, though, in response to Brad's query, that the new American dream for cities has to incorporate what we've learned from the way in which cities and regions operate and reimagine cities in a more socially just and an inclusive way. That cities in the United States have functioned in a variety of productive ways, but often in very unequal ways. The thing that we need to do is to make equity, egalitarianism, inclusiveness the center of our thinking about what the future of cities should be.
So in my role as 35th Ward Alderman, I speak with a lot of residents. I knock doors constantly. People come to my office. And I think that multiplicity of American dreams is very evident to me, particularly representing an area that is and has been called ground zero for gentrification. In the past 20 years, we've seen about 19,000 mostly Latinx working class residents displaced from the community, Logan Square, Hermosa, Avondale, the surrounding area. And for so many people, in my community, the working class folks, the American dream is much more traditional, right? It's buying a home, raising your kids, sending them off to college, particularly for the immigrant Latina families that I represent. For the newcomers to the community, there are those that want to live in an integrated community, and I'm very happy and proud that a majority are the ones that want to live in an integrated community, and they want to build upon the diversity that attracted them initially to Logan Square. And then there are some that move to the community and their American dream is to displace everyone else that doesn't look like them, that is seen as poor, or that is seen as undesirable, and to maximize the return on their home. And in some ways I can't fault them because their American dream also includes retirement. And in a world where we have seen the decimation of pensions, I'm sure some of you in this room are like, what's a pension? We have to fight for pensions as young people so that we could have a dignified retirement. But in a world where we've also lived through the volatility of the stock market, and we've seen so many retirees have their savings wiped out in just a matter of days or hours, For so many Americans, retirement is now tied into their ability to sell their single family home, right? Or their two flat, that one asset that they have. And so a lot of people that move to Logan Square, move to Hermosa, move to Avondale, view their ability to have a dignified retirement, to see an increase in their wealth tied to the displacement of poor people and brown people from the community. And so I think that in Logan Square, the progressive forces, the working class people, the middle class people who want to build a different type of American dream, we've come together around a vision of a community that's integrated and diverse, around a vision of a community that's walkable. And what I really love is that so much of the young white professionals that have lent themselves to this project and have been active in this project, in many ways, they're responding to the failures of the American dream of the mid-20th century. Some of the most militant urbanists, people who demand bike lanes, people who demand to be able to walk down the street to a locally owned small businesses, people who demand good running public transportation, people who demand multi-unit family housing, 2 flats, 3 flats, 4 flats, they grew up in a suburban prison. And I think that's just really interesting. So I vibe with what my panelists are saying in terms of the multiplicity of different American dreams. It's interesting, but I think in the end, everyone just wants to have a dignified life and be able to at some point retire and not have to work every single day.
Yeah, can I just jump
Sure.
in one more thing? I mean, I think another important word to throw into the mix is like the idea of freedom, right? I mean, and yesterday on the panel, they sort of invoked sort of, Foner's notion of negative freedoms and positive freedoms in the sense that we need to unleash our radical imaginations, as Robin D.G. Kelley has said, to imagine what is our freedom dream? And I think these freedom dreams that you talk about, that I know that my parents who were immigrants came to America wanting, it was, they didn't want to displace people, but they did. That wasn't part of their dream, right? Their dream was economic freedom, it was social mobility, it was religious freedom, it was freedom from the oppression that they were sort of enduring in China. And so there's a kind of sense where, what does freedom mean today? And I think what is really, really important is the recent sociological studies that show that home ownership turns the most progressive person into a terrible person. Literally. It's just this idea that somehow you have to protect your investment and that everyone becomes a NIMBY when it turns to home ownership, right? So the thing that, for me that I'm grappling with now is I see that this is the way that people have generated wealth, passed down wealth. It's been many people, especially Black and brown people, have been, excluded from this because of racist policies. But it's just sort of is home ownership part of the freedom dream, or is it what is stopping us from realizing our freedoms, that we are trying to create for everybody?
Wow, they're off to a terrific start. I heard a lot of great themes here. I heard about dignity, equity, freedom, and then specific policy areas around housing, retirement. We could add others to this around education, healthcare, secure jobs, pensions. Part of that adds up to something that you were getting at, Lisa, called security. And there seems to be a tension between security and individualism, freedom, and these other values. I wonder if we could talk a bit about how these values might be in tension, as you've kind of mentioned. Can we have a new American dream for cities with what would security look like in that instance? I don't know, I kind of rambled there a bit, but maybe there are themes there you can run with. Security is something that I'm sure, Alderman, that your constituents wrestle with all the time, and they see that as a fundamental concern. You want to touch on security and what that means in their context?
I think that a lot of the national discourse does not capture the nuance of what most voters and what most people actually feel around public safety. We hear the term defund, we hear people yell, no, we absolutely need more police. I think most constituents that I've spoken to in my community understand that policing is not a silver bullet, that we have over-incarcerated, particularly poor Black people, that we have a racist policing system, a racist criminal justice system, and that it desperately needs to be reformed. And if you look at decades of research, study after study shows that investing in education, jobs, healthcare, housing, that has more of an impact in reducing violence and crime than investing in prisons and police. And residents understand that. Again, we live in a very progressive area in my community on the Northwest Side. We actually just had a June 28th Democratic primary cycle where the candidates who were attacked as defund were the candidates that won. And if you look at kind of the polling, what was occurring was that the candidates that were attacking, the more conservative, moderate candidates that were attacking the more progressive candidates as defund candidates, were actually pushing voters into that camp because they were communicating to them, we don't represent your progressive values. And so I think that you know, the moderate conservative candidates that were on the ballot on June 28th on the Northwest Side, they were paying attention to the national headlines, right? That there's this backlash against defund, that people want more police. They weren't actually having conversations with people in their community and meeting them where they're at. And if you meet people where they're at, people are actually brilliant. People actually don't fall for just these boilerplate talking points. They actually understand that these issues are very complicated and that there's a lot of nuance involved. And so most of the people in my community do not want to abolish the police, but they do understand that government must do more to meet people's needs, and that will have a profound impact in making our community safe. And so in this notion of the American dream and public safety, I think that we need to reimagine our cities and reimagine the American dream as a society where we all have the things that we need, right? Where we have a society of care. One of my colleagues, Alderwoman Rossana Rodriguez, she always talks about wanting to create a department of care, right? This notion that we as a city should be looking at what are the things that our youth need, what are the things that our elders need, what are the things that workers need, that immigrants need, that Black people need, brown people need, white people need. Let's figure out what do people need to survive and thrive, and then let's make sure that we're creating systems. You know, that's something that's quite foreign because for the past several decades, you know, since Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, we've been telling people that actually government can't do things, shouldn't do things, right? That we should tighten our belts, that we should disinvest, that we should push things to the private sector. And so all of those things that we used to have that provided some semblance of care in many ways have gone away. And so in some ways we have to rebuild the capacity of government to provide for people. And by providing for people, we then create the conditions where we can all thrive and be safe.
Yeah.
Carlos, don't you think we also have to think about ways to make citizens more effective contributors to what I'll call governance as opposed to government? That to go back to this idea of security, it isn't simply a matter of having lots and lots of police so that you can arrest everybody who looks potentially threatening. It's creating an environment in which on a day-to-day basis people experience and practice freedom, but at the same time they know that there's some sort of backstop. And so we have to think, I think, about what are the kind of structures to put in place that people can contribute to, can grow as citizens, and also communicate to government itself, okay, you're doing a good job here, you need to make adjustments to the way in which you're approaching things, there are better ways to go about what government does. And that's a really difficult, I think, set of challenges because we really have fallen into that habit of thinking there's government and then there's the private sector, and then if we're slightly sophisticated, we say, well, there's civic society too. But actually thinking about how those things work with one another in a way in which people both feel as if they're not having to, you know, what was Oscar Wilde's claim about the problem of socialism, and it takes up all your nights. How do you, in effect, have a life of your own, a life in the community, and a life in which community and individuals can self-govern and contribute to security, but also growth, to development?
Yeah, I love the way that you both answered that question. And I'm thinking about the history of public housing where the tenants came together and sort of in the face of both sort of over surveillance and over policing, but complete lack of safety for their people, formed tenant patrols where they said, we need to self-organize and we're not going to call the police, but we're actually going to say, this is what real safety looks like, which included checking on old folks, making sure that they had food to eat, that the buildings were well cared after, that the children were being walked to school, right? So this kind of idea of mutual aid and mutual care for one another, which creates real safety. But it doesn't sort of disobligate the government from its responsibility to care for its people then, which is like really, really important, which is sometimes, I think, a problem with a lot of not a lot, but some mutual aid practices, especially in the relational art fields. Like, we're sort of doing all the work that basically the government should and could be doing for us. And so we have to remember there's a kind of tension there. But then I sort of think back to the Hull House, this incredible settlement house on the near West Side during the first New Deal that really reimagined radically, and I use that word radical, very intentional, like as the sort of Ella Baker way, where it was like it's like a math term, right? It's like, how do you get to the radical square root? It's like getting to the root of the problem, where they're like, in order for us to have real safety for the community and the neighborhood, and for us to flourish as the first generation of white women who are entering the political sphere, we need to make sure that the state is responsible for its people. And it included just a radical host of things that included things like the 8-hour workday, ending to stop, child labor, and places for people to play, but also theater and dance and sort of art classes and literature, places for people to express their full humanity as sentient beings, like feeling and thinking, and that they realized that if we can't dance and love together, we're not going to be able to create a society together, right? So arts and culture were held just as importantly as sort of other forms of organizing. And no disrespect to electoral politics, but I just think it's really important to remind people that those women and the residents and the immigrants in that neighborhood created some of the most incredible social welfares of our day. But it was before women even had the right to vote, right? So suffrage was important, but they didn't reduce themselves and their civic responsibility to just casting a ballot, right? Like, voting was absolutely critical, but there was many other ways that people should and could be responsible. And my friend Barbara Ransby always says, like, what voting is like. Voting is like brushing your teeth. You have to do it every day, otherwise bad things happen. But it's not the only thing that you do for your health, right? Like, I think it's really critical. And so I think back to sort of the ways that all of these, and how it links that history to the contemporary moment, right? Like, how would mental health care increase safety for all of us, right, in our streets, in the issues of gun violence, and what we're all dealing with, right? Like, there's all of these things that I think we can look back to history to see a lot of ways of how we can move forward.
It was interesting, I asked about security, and we all kind of went towards public safety. Is there security in other aspects of our life, like employment and healthcare and housing, that can that be a uniting theme in potentially a new American dream? You want to talk about housing security, or I don't know, is healthcare something that your constituents are constantly in your office about? And Larry, you've worked on the jobs issue at length in trying to develop sustainable, good quality jobs that don't require necessarily a college degree.
Well, I think that it's a little bit like the intellectual divide between positive freedom and negative freedom. Mm-hmm. You can say that there's positive security and negative security. Negative security is the sort of minimal, well, I hope I can walk out the front door in the morning and not get shot. But the positive security is more of a sense that in a variety of ways, one can live a life which is going to be unencumbered by need, so that there is an expectation that housing will be available. There is an expectation that job seekers will be able to find fulfilling and well-compensated employment. And I think that the way in which the welfare state or the social welfare state in the United States has typically been deflected is by calling that kind of positive security that I'm talking about, well, that's the nanny state. That's government taking care of everything for people. But to go back to what I was saying before, I think that government has a crucial role in terms of backstopping all of those things and making provisions, but then it becomes a question of how government action interacts with communities and community structures and civil society. So if we go back specifically to policing, clearly the thing that we haven't gotten to yet in Chicago is a way in which you can have a positive engagement of the citizenry with then the official government and the police department and the things that it does. And we struggle with that, and we create new institutions, and we're maybe moving in a positive direction at this point, but it's clearly a struggle. But I think it's this really interesting challenge of how we use the resources and the routines of government in a way in which we can activate citizens and make them productive contributors to, you know, a sort of big tent notion of security.
Mm-hmm. Can I maybe just quickly say too, this is like a deep secret. Even though I'm at the National Public Housing Museum, I don't actually think housing is that special over any other thing. I mean, like I just started working there, you know, a couple of years ago, but for me, public housing is a kind of lens, right? But public housing is really, my emphasis is on the word public, right? And it's our troubled relationship with the idea of what should be a public good, what is in the commonwealth, and what is not commodified and just sort of something that people will profiteer off of, right? So whether that's housing or it's healthcare or it's, you know, a whole range of other things like education or public safety, all of these things have seen the encroachment of the private sphere. And, you know, there's nothing necessarily evil in itself about the private sphere either, except for that the private sphere is unregulated and it's a place where things become sort of subjected to like ruthless profiteering and the sort of domain of racial capitalism. So which means that there's certain people who are going to win and a very small number of people, right, as we can see what's happened in the sort of divide of wealth in our whole global nation, and many people who are going to lose out. And so for me, the issue, like your question is so good, which is like we need to grapple as a nation when we're talking about a new American dream / dreams with what are we going to say is still a common good and part of the Commonwealth, including things like water, which as we've seen in Flint and other places have, right, like these basic things have become privatized. And that is so dangerous for any kind of freedom dreaming for any of us. And so I think that's really important for us to be thinking about.
You all have been working in these fields. Let's get specific on some of the things that, you know, the projects that you've worked on. Let's get a little concrete in some of the ideas and projects you've worked on that would start moving us in these paths that are examples of the kinds of new city that we might be able to build. I know you've done a lot, Alderman, in thinking through what this would be on the ground in the 35th Ward.
Yeah, I love what you brought up in terms of, you know, residents of a community being active participants, right? They're not just passive, right? It's not just things that the private sector or that government are doing to them, but that they are actually engaged in governance and in self-determination for their communities. And one of the things that, you know, democratic socialists believe is that socialism is democracy and democracy is socialism, right? The notion that we don't need the Donald Trumps or the Bruce Rauners of the world telling us what to do. You know, you go to your job and the boss tells you what to do. You're in school, you know, the teacher tells you what to do. And then in our civic life, right, the rich and the powerful, right, invest heavily in elections and in turn, you know, essentially capture all of our governmental institutions. So I think that, you know, as a socialist, one of the first things that I sought to do in office was to democratize decision-making in my community. And the role of alderman is very unique because we're not just a city council member, but we are also local administrators. And so through practice, we control all zoning and land use decisions in our community. So this is called member deference in some places. In the city of Chicago, we know it as aldermanic prerogative. And so that means that developers have gotten accustomed to cutting $5,000, $10,000 checks to aldermanic campaign funds. In some instances, they cut the check directly to the alderman, then people go to jail. But they cut the check to the campaign fund, and then the alderman goes out and says, it's a done deal, right? We've made a decision. This is the best interest of the community. This is what we're going to build in your neighborhood. So one of the first things that we did is we instituted a participatory planning process, which we call community-driven zoning and development, because we love very verbose things in our community. But we call it community-driven zoning development. And what it does is it empowers local community groups. They have to be neighbor-led organizations, so they can't be groups of self-appointed realtors or developers. They have to be people that are in the community, live in the community. And they have to exist for a purpose other than zoning review. So they have to be focused on beautification or bringing people together to, address issues at the local schools or in the neighborhood. By virtue of being that civic organization that's organizing on the ground, you then get to then play a role in zoning review. They meet directly with the developer. They ask the developer for concessions. They ask the developer for community benefit agreements. They make design changes. And then once the community group or the community groups have worked with the developer, then what happens is it goes to the community as a whole to be reviewed in a large community assembly. We've had some community assemblies where 6 people attend. We've had others where 600 people attend. And as a result of this process, we actually were able to build a 100-unit all-affordable housing development in the heart of Logan Square, right across the street from the Logan Square Blue Line stop. This was an underutilized parking lot, publicly owned. See, back in the day when we thought the cities were going to totally collapse and everyone was moving to the suburbs and we all had to be car-centric, the city bought some property near Milwaukee Avenue, Logan Square, because there was this horrible idea for a Milwaukee pedestrian mall. And they were going to tear down all these buildings around Milwaukee Avenue to create hundreds and hundreds of parking spots. Luckily, the only thing that ever happened is they built this one parking lot. So there's about 120 parking spots, totally underutilized. And Rahm Emanuel gets it into his head, I'm going to redevelop this. And I'm a 26-year-old alderman, and some of the richest people in the city of Chicago are coming to lobby me to tell me that they want to work with the city of Chicago to redevelop this site into a luxury tower. My community had come together collectively and say, no, we're going to use this as an opportunity to address displacement and to achieve the diverse, integrated community, socioeconomically, racially, that we want to see. And we want to therefore then see an all-affordable housing development on this site. And I told those developers no. I told the Department of Planning and Development, at that point controlled by Mayor Rahm Emanuel, no. And that initiated a multi-year-long fight to redevelop that site as an all-affordable housing development. That building is now built. It's called the Lucy Gonzalez Parsons Apartments, named after a woman of color, labor activist, fierce woman. And it's housing people today. And so that's just one example of how in our community we're working to bring people together. And so I really like what you talked about people getting involved, because I love this notion of the American dream being involved in your community, right? Getting active and fighting, not just for yourself, but for your neighbors. And I think that there is a lot of truth to that the people that are happiest in my community are the ones that are showing up for each other, are the ones that are engaging in those mutual aid efforts and taking care of their homeless neighbors and working with their neighbors to beautify parks. And so those are some of the things that we've done in the 35th Ward to bring people together and to create a better community for everyone.
So let me ask you about the example of the Logan Square development, which was a fight, as you said. And I followed that a little bit in the press. Do you think that people who are in different positions with regard to that development learned something from the process as they jousted with one another over it? Because I think that that's really the sort of critical thing about community planning in diverse neighborhoods. It's about getting particular things done, but do you also have some sort of social learning that comes from people actually beginning to see other people's perspectives and understanding that maybe they have to come to the next community planning meeting with a more sophisticated outlook than they had last time?
Absolutely. So there's a group called Logan Square Neighborhood Association, which is like an old school Alinsky style organization, right? You bring people together in the community, you decide what your interests are, and then you fight for it. You make demands. They've since renamed themselves Palenque LSNA. And then there was a group called Logan Square Preservation, which someone on Twitter flippantly calls them the Lords of Logan Boulevard. And historically, these two groups were at odds, right? When I was elected alderman, I have to meet with everyone. And so I would go to LSNA and they would say, those LSP people, they're all a bunch of NIMBYs and they want to displace all the poor brown people. And then I'd go to the LSP meeting and they'd say, oh, they're all a bunch of crazy activists. They think we're all racist. We're not. And so through this community-driven zoning process, we actually forced them to sit down together and to talk about what was it that was in the community's collective interest. And what they came to realize is that the LSP members wanted to see development that was in line with the historic nature of the community. And that the Logan Square Neighborhood Association members wanted to see zoning and local development policies that did not exacerbate displacement and at best would help mitigate displacement and keep people in their homes. And there was a realization at some point that those two goals were not at odds, right? That poor and working class people want to live in a beautiful neighborhood too, right? They want to live in a neighborhood that has a sense of place, right? That has a sense of uniqueness. And that whether you were a new white resident or a longer term, more moneyed white resident or a working class Latino resident, that there was actually a lot in common. And since the institution of this process, LSNA and LSP have now been working together seamlessly, collectively for a very long time, for many, many years now. And I think one of the things that I'm most proud of is when Logan Square Preservation put out their quarterly, one of their quarterly newsletters last year. And they talked about as an organization, they were not just oriented towards the preservation of buildings, but that they were also now oriented towards the preservation of the people that live in that community and that make up that community. And so absolutely, my experience has been that when you force people to sit down together and talk to each other, that those that may have a bit more power and privilege begin to understand better the perspective of the people who are sometimes the most vulnerable in the neighborhood.
Lisa, you've been working, I know a lot of your work, you've been doing civic love and the object. Do you want to talk about one of your projects, maybe that one? I don't know.
Yeah, sure. So as Carlos was talking, I definitely feel like what the museum does is in the kind of arts and cultural realm, but so similar, right? Like so much of what we were talking about of like, how do we understand a different person's perspective, or how do we understand how to unmake the world and remake it, is exactly what is the work of artists and cultural makers in society. And so we very intentionally have a program director who is the director of arts, culture, and public policy, and we find as many ways as possible as bringing artists and creative people into the process, including public policy. And so one of the things that we have is an oral history archive that really tries to figure out ways of turning people's stories, and which is an important form of cultural capital, into other forms of capital that can be used to benefit the community. We have a program that Brad mentioned called Civic Love, which is 36 questions that we help to craft with a whole group of community residents, which is a way of people coming together as strangers and learning to talk with one another with critical generosity, right? Like you can't really understand someone's position, I think, about guns, policing, housing, unless you maybe understand what their grandmother kept in their sort of kitchen cabinet. Like, or you understand their position better when you know where they went to high school, how they see the world. And so this brings people together to talk, to get to know one another, and to sort of understand where these positions have come from. And our most recent sort of project was with Tanika Lewis-Johnson, a really marvelous artist who is most known for her work in Folded Map, but she also did a project called Inequity for Sale with us at the National Public Housing Museum, which looked at a white paper about the history of unjust land sale contracts, which was created by Amber Headley and other researchers at Duke University. And it showed this nefarious practice that led to so much disinvestment and also sort of the lack of Black people's wealth that could be generated from home ownership in Chicago. And it turned it into a kind of monument memorial project where at these houses that have been stolen from Black families, there is a monument and that you can actually go see now. If you go to our website, you can go into the city and look at these monuments. It tells the history of those families, and it demands reparations. And I think that's a really important word to grapple with. And I know that Richard Rothstein says that reparations is too touchy for people, so he prefers the word remediation, for example. But whatever the word you use, as someone who works at a history museum, I deeply, deeply believe that we're not going to address any of the problems today unless we go back in time, ask what we have not yet learned, and also realize that there are past harms that have been done that actually need to be repaired or remediated in order for us to have true equity, right? And that kind of sort of notion of how do we create policies, and I'm very proud that Chicago is actually one of the first cities in the United States to have a reparations package that passed, which was around police violence, the Chicago Torture Justice Center and the Monument Project, which emerged from it, that we're still fighting to get the monument built. But this was like an epic 21st century event that we passed a reparations package here in Chicago, Reparations 1, that acknowledged the histories of unjust policing and found ways to reparate it, which is beyond just sort of cash, which was very important, but thinking about how do we actually address trauma, how do we think about the built environment, the landscape, so that we will all remember this history and work together to make sure it never happens again. And I think that there's a way where housing policy also needs to have a kind of reparations package in the city. And one of my favorite phrases I heard recently was, there is no problem in housing that is too big that ending systemic racism can't solve, right? And I think that's so.
Say that again. There's no problem in housing.
That's too big that ending systemic racism can't solve. And I think like us coming to terms with how white supremacy has really, unleashed a whole history of terror on groups of people and created these unlevel playing fields. The history of redlining that I know was talked about yesterday, that has led to segregation and the lack of, and this huge disparity in wealth between white people and people of color. Like, we have to find ways of redressing this if we're really going to be able to move forward. And so I think there's a way that we can do this through arts, through culture, that will not only bring all this research to light, but really convince people that this is the way that we want to move forward. That's the last thing I want to say about this, which is that when I was in college, somebody said the worst thing you could do is have the Cassandra effect. Cassandra, like in Greek mythology, right, she always spoke the truth, but nobody believed her. And sometimes when I see all these white papers about housing or academic scholarship, I'm like, all of this truth, but nobody is going to believe it. Like, how do we find ways for people to engaging with this truth? And I feel like Tanika's work, other artists' work, it makes this revolution irresistible, in the words of Toni Cade Bambara. Yeah.
Terrific. I'm going to ask one more question, then we'll open up to the audience. We just talked about structural racism, and we in the Academy have wrestled with this, written about it, taught about it. How, and you've just mentioned art as a form of communicating this and hopefully get people to believe it. On the ground at the North Works or in the 35th Ward, is this, how do you explain to people or unravel structural racism in communities that don't have perhaps the luxury of time to study it in a college environment or elsewhere? Or maybe you can challenge the premise of that question too.
Well, let me talk about that organization and what it does. And I don't know that directly dealing with structural racism is an outcome that we affect through our work. On the other hand, I think in terms of thinking of social class and economic disparities, that's the more central sort of concern. North Branch Works is one of the 24 neighborhood economic development organizations in the city that began with an effort to protect industry. Not in the sense that we loved the capitalists of Morton Salt or General Iron or any of these other big firms, but rather because industry had historically in Chicago provided well-paying blue-collar jobs for a large part of the local population. And as the city changed in the middle to latter decades of the 20th century, a variety of forces were pushing industry away. And North Branch Works basically focuses on the area from about Kinsey Street on the very near northwest side up to about, to Belmont and pretty into Carlos's ward a little bit. And it's an area which historically has had a large number of manufacturers of one type or another. As the city has changed, North Branch Works' orientation has changed to become more encompassing in its advocacy for local businesses that are clean in an environmental sense, that will, as we have always wanted, provide jobs for blue-collar employees, and essentially can contribute to, again, neighborhood security in some of the adjoining working-class areas, particularly to the west of the river. And so I think for us, the sort of central challenge is advocating for local businesses in order to get better and more effective city services, and in particular to affect land use policy and planning by the city. But at the same time, also realizing that you have people who live in these neighborhoods. And some of them are residents who don't have a whole lot to do with these local businesses. In other cases, they are households in which somebody works in these businesses. So it's finding a way to smooth the transition that the city is moving through to a post-industrial economy. It's attempting to encourage the kind of artisanal development that Chicago seems to really be a center of in terms of a variety of more specialized kinds of productions, and thinking of how you can have economic corridors like the North Branch coexist with residential areas in such a way so that people can continue to feel at home in their neighborhoods and feel as if these are good places to live. And so race per se is probably secondary in our thinking. It's more about class and economic equity. But the two things are not separate. It's just that in this particular case, I think that the social class and economic disparities are more central to what we do.
Chicago is such a racist city. It is such a racist city. And I think that, as much as we talk about, oh, what a beautiful, diverse city, we're a third Black, a third Latino, a third white.
Don't forget us.
That's right. That's right. We are still so segregated. We are incredibly segregated. And when we see opposition to building public housing or affordable housing, it is always rooted in anti-Blackness. It is always rooted in anti-Blackness and also classism. I think that to get past our ugly history of segregation and our current contemporary reality of segregation and racism, it's really incumbent upon people to come together. And I know, come together, what does that mean? I think it's incumbent upon us to build relationships, to have conversations. In the context of the 35th Ward, what that has looked like, that's looked like popular education. Last term, I voted against the police academy. I was the only alderman to do that. And I remember some of my corporate Democratic friends, because you gotta be friends with everybody. But they were like, oh, your career's over, right? You're done. And in response to kind of the backlash that I received from that, we worked with young Black organizers from the West Side, groups like Asada's Daughters, the No Cop Academy campaign, and we had a popular education workshop in Kosciuszko Park in my ward. And we went door to door, we talked to people, we invited them out to this meeting to talk about, why we as a city shouldn't be investing more in a police academy and instead should be investing things that actually would make us safe. It looks like, community meetings. One of the things that we've done in the 35th Ward is after the election of Donald Trump, we initiated a community defense committee. Again, with the names, right? But we had a community defense committee, and what we did is we had meetings with hundreds of people where we talked about what was the threat that existed with, Donald Trump, declaring war on undocumented immigrants and bringing forward the specter of ICE raids in our community. We went door to door and informed thousands of people of their rights and what they should do in the instance that ICE or any other agent knocks on their door. We also engaged in civil disobedience trainings where we practice, should we see an ICE vehicle in our community, what we would do to interrupt and disrupt that deportation. Thankfully, Trump was all talk on this. There were a lot of people that were terrorized, but we never saw the raids in our community the way that we envisioned that it could be carried out. After the kind of the threat of Trump and ICE raids in our community subsided, the Community Defense Committee shifted its focus to protecting homeless encampments. When a homeless encampment not too far away from Mayor Lightfoot's home received a notice that they were going to be forcibly pushed out, we joined with the Chicago Coalition of the Homeless, we joined with the Illinois Union of the Homeless, and residents from the community organized through the Community Defense Committee, through a mutual aid network, showed up and defended the encampment and put forward a message of give us a home or leave us alone, right? And called upon the city to instead not engage in homeless sweeps, but instead to actually do the things necessary to get people off the street and into permanent housing. So I think that all of that work has been critically important towards, addressing the history of racism and the reality of racism in the city of Chicago. I think it's consistent, ongoing work. And I got to tell you, I'm always scared about our seniors. I'm always scared about our people that are isolated in their homes just watching Tucker Carlson and Fox News all day, because their head is being filled with the most hateful, vile, idiotic messages. But I'm always hardened by the fact that when I go and knock their door and they come to me with these right-wing tropes and you just have a meaningful conversation, right? I'm not like, oh, you're canceled, right? Or like, you're racist, right? No, I just have a real conversation with them. And I'll say, oh, that's an interesting perspective. Right? And then we start to unpack that, right? And we actually start to talk about what really happens in the community. Within a few minutes, it's almost like we have inoculated them from all of the nonsense that they've been hearing on Fox News all day. So I think it's incredibly important that we get off of our screens, that we get off of the TV, and that we actually meet each other where we're at and have those meaningful conversations.
Yeah, can I also say,
Sure.
I mean, I need you to come talk to my dad, who is a Fox News devotee, right? And I've always found it so much easier to change structural things and structural racism than to deal with individuals, because I think my dad is just so stubborn. And I think you mentioned earlier, for example, some tools, and I just want to invoke the Lord, Audre Lorde, the master's tools will not dismantle the master's house. And we actually have really great tools to dismantle structural racism in our city. Like, for example, you mentioned CBAs, right? Community benefits agreements. That is a great tool for all institutions as they start to work with communities to try to figure out, how can we actually benefit the community, not just extract wealth, and also find ways of addressing potentially future displacement or whatever it might be. I always think about, at the National Public Housing Museum, and we are a museum and a cultural institution. There is a huge problem in cultural workers being overwhelmingly white in not just the city of Chicago, but all across the country. I mean, the Joyce Foundation put out a report, and it was so dismal. The percentage of people of color who work in museums, overwhelmingly, 95% of the time, are actually the security forces or the janitorial staff in museums, right? And one of the things that they did to change that, they made a recommendation, which is to end unpaid internships, right? For generations, museums would offer unpaid internships to people, and then you would get an internship, your foot in the door, then you would apply for a job and move on. But who are the people who can actually take unpaid internships, right? It's mostly privileged people. And so if you actually insist that cultural institutions pay all their interns a living wage, that radically changes the demographic of people who can actually work in museums. And that's just a tweak, a commitment to equity that is a structural thing that can change, as opposed to sort of pointing out, as Carlos was saying, or canceling one individual, director because that they're racist or classist or sexist. I mean, I think that's a terrible practice, because when you do that for one individual, you're not actually addressing the real structural problems, And so I think that if we look around, we can create our toolboxes, of all of these things that can help to dismantle these terrible systems and move forward. So I'm extremely hopeful, even though we sort of were talking about all these terrible things, about a collective future, because people are doing that work. You all are doing that work as young people every single day. Yeah.
Thank you. Let's open it up to questions. Please approach the microphones on both sides of the aisles.
Here comes somebody.
Welcome.
Hi, sorry about the delay. So the most about the disabled community that was really mentioned in the panel was just a very fleeting correlation between mental health and the crisis of gun violence. But obviously the disabled community exists. I mean, how many people in this room may or may not have at least one disability? There are 48.9 million disabled individuals in America. How do we go about and how do we include in the overall community, the disabled community, when more often than not, the disabled community physically can't even enter the room, much less the conversation?
Thank you.
Oh, sure,
Want to tackle that?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you for uplifting that.
Thank you.
That's so important. And, you know, I think in my local policymaking, I've been very lucky to work with Access Living, who has often come to me and said, you know, these are the issues impacting our community, and we need you to be a champion for these issues. When we worked on building the all-affordable 100-unit Lucy Gonzalez Parsons apartments, that was actually an area where we erred early on. And Access Living came to us and said, you need to do these things to make sure that these units are accessible. And that there is a prioritization, because one of the hardest things for people living with disabilities is oftentimes finding affordable housing that is accessible. And luckily, thanks to their intervention, we were able to make changes to the building to ensure that that was achieved. So I think that that is extremely important, and thank you for that intervention.
Well, and you know, we didn't talk very much about physical development in cities. And there's certainly a variety of ways in which disabled people can be accommodated. And historically, there was very little of that. I think some progress has been made, and obviously we have particular instances in which activism pushes particular projects in that direction. But it's something that we can certainly make much more central to our thinking about public spaces, accessibility to housing, and so on.
Yeah, no, and I really want to thank you for raising that issue too. And we really have the disability rights movement to thank for pushing almost every single one of the movements to become more inclusive, more expansive, and capacious about how we think about what it means to live and work and love in a just city. And I have to say that in the museum field in particular, you know, this is a great example of when the law is just the lowest minimum denominator of what we possibly can and should be doing. I can't tell you the amount of times when I've gone into architectural meetings or otherwise where people just say, oh, I assure you that we are ADA accessible, but it doesn't mean that the space is truly inclusive, right? And so we have to always be aware of the importance of us changing laws, and also the fact that we're living constantly in motion, that justice, we're always bending the arc of justice, and that the law is always going to be catching up to the sort of most brilliant activists and advocates who are pushing us to think differently about it. So then that goes, from sort of we've committed to ASL labels, for example, in the museum. We're rethinking and trying to expand and extend, everything that we do for public programming and making sure we're as inclusive as possible. And admitting that we have so much to learn, and sometimes, it's about just how we really put out the call for hiring people and how we understand what it means, what is the job, and who gets to do it in the way that we framed it. So I think this is a really critical issue to bring up, and thanks for, reminding us to raise it always and often.
Yeah, we've been behind, that's been an incredibly neglected field, but now disability studies in universities is starting to take off. This is a 21st century issue that is not, is going to be central, I think, among not just students, but join the pantheon of civil rights issues, if it hasn't already. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Okay, so I wanted to ask about how aldermanic prerogative plays a role and how they get to draw their own maps, and how that can impact communities in a positive or negative way, especially when you have people like Alderman Burke, who are a part of the V29 United Against Harold Washington just because of his race. How does that negatively impact communities, and do you see it getting better in the city council?
Yeah, You know, aldermanic prerogative is a double-edged sword because in some ways, aldermen are the most accountable elected officials to their community. There's a lot more turnover in the Chicago City Council than there is in the US Congress, than there is in the Illinois House, than there is in the Illinois Senate, than there's on the County Board of Commissioners. About every 4 years, at least a quarter of aldermen leave, either because they retire or because they're voted out. We're on record to surpass that this year. And a lot of aldermen have lost elections over the zoning decisions that they make in their community. If you look at Alderman Scott Waguespack, he beat an incumbent that was entrenched and that was in the pocket of developers. Myself, the #1 issue that we heard on the doors when I beat that 12-year incumbent was development. Neighbors around me have won their seats to the city council. So in some ways there is the democratic function of, you know, the alderman controls the local zoning and land use decisions. It's not, you know, a bunch of planners downtown that you don't know about, right? You literally know. If that was built there and that got a zoning change, it was that person right there, right, that allowed that. And so in some ways, you know, the development of a participatory planning process to democratize, right? Because that's what we use. We use the power of aldermanic prerogative in my ward. The fact that I control and have the final say on local zoning and land use decisions. We use that to democratize the process, right? I then say to the community, I'm empowering you all through a transparent, inclusive, democratic process to hold that power. Not every alderman does that. And I think that, you know, for me as a democratic socialist, in response to aldermanic prerogative, I resist vehemently the push to say, well, we then need to centralize everything downtown. Because I think that downtown, I think that, you know, the planners, I think that, you know, the mayor's office is equally susceptible to corruption, is equally susceptible to using that power of zoning and land use to the benefit of the rich and powerful, to the detriment of the many. And so for me, I think that the response should be more participatory planning processes. You know, Chicago engaged in the We Will process recently. I wasn't very impressed, to be very honest. I don't think that there was really meaningful community engagement. But I think that, you know, what I would like to see is more democratization of, you know, these zoning processes. I am always amazed by the capacity of people in my community, regardless of their educational background, to almost immediately begin to understand what is good land use process. I'm sorry to the professional planners, you're probably like, but no, I think that some things are kind of just intuitive, some things are common sense, right? There's a reason why prior to zoning laws being implemented, people were building wonderful cities that were walkable, right? Because it's just intuitive, it makes sense to the human experience and the ways that, you know, we live our lives in ways that align with our reality. But yeah, I think that definitely, you know, the abuse of aldermanic prerogative is the problem when aldermen, you know, sell their zoning decisions to the highest bidder, when they use it to perpetuate racism. But I think that, like, it's a tool like any other, right? Like, that tool can be used for good in the way that we have in our community. In the wrong hands, it can be used for evil.
Carlos, in light of that, what do you think of proposals to reduce the number of aldermen, cutting it from 50 down to, you name it, 15 or 20, something like that? Yeah.
You know, I think that we have wards. We're running for alderman, costs $1 million plus. I think last cycle in Lincoln Park, it was like, I don't know, $5 million. It was like a ridiculous amount of money that was spent. And then we have wards where, you know, like right now in the 35th ward, me and my opponent, we got $50,000 between the two of us. I got 45,000, he's got 5. Which other wards are like, oh, that's all the money that you've got? It's like, we've got people power. But yeah, I think that my fear is that reducing the number of aldermen would lead to an increase in the cost of running for aldermen. So I'd like to see some other structural changes, like publicly financed campaigns. I'd like to see perhaps an exploration of term limits. I do think that there is some efficacy to that. I'd like to see changes to the way in which we vote. You know, perhaps allowing people to, oh gosh, what's it called again? Where when you vote, you also choose your second or third choice.
Ranked choice.
Ranked choice voting,
yeah.
yes.
I think that's great.
So to me, I think those changes would help make the city council truly a council of the people and help move us in that direction. I've seen the positive impacts that those types of changes have had in other cities before I would reduce the number of aldermen.
We're about out of time, unless there was one urgent question, but I think this has been just terrific. Thank you all. What inspiring work being done on this stage. Thank you, and thanks to Margie Rung and Roosevelt University for sponsoring this terrific event. Thank you.
Thank you. Sure.
Yes, you can do that. You too.